Picture this. It's July 25th, 2024. A private plane lands quietly at a small airstrip near El Paso, Texas. On board, two men. One of them thinks he's heading to a business meeting, maybe a negotiation, maybe a handshake deal, somewhere safe across the border. But the moment that plane touches down on American soil, federal agents are already waiting. The man who steps off that plane isn't just any criminal. He is Ismael El Mayo Zambada, the co-founder of the most powerful drug trafficking organization in the history of the world. A man who had evaded every government, every DEA agent, every military operation for over 50 years. And here's the twist. He wasn't caught by the feds. He was betrayed by one of his own, by El Chapo's own son. The man who built an empire worth billions of dollars, who flooded America with cocaine, heroin, and fentanyl, who watched rivals get buried while he sipped coffee in the mountains of Sinaloa, was lured onto a plane like a common fool. This is the story of the Sinaloa Cartel, where it started, how it became a monster, and what's happening to it right now. Buckle up, because this one is wild from start to finish. To understand the Sinaloa Cartel, you have to understand the land it was born in. The state of Sinaloa sits on Mexico's Pacific coast. Rugged mountains, deep valleys, and dirt roads that go nowhere. For generations, the families living there were farmers, poor farmers. And the most profitable crop they could grow wasn't corn or wheat. It was poppy and marijuana. By the 1960s and 70s, these farming families had quietly become some of the most important drug suppliers in the region. It wasn't glamorous. It was survival. But it was also the seed of something massive. One of the first men to traffic large quantities of marijuana out of the region was Pedro Aviles. And it was Aviles who brought a young kid named Joaquin Guzman Lora into the business. That kid would later be known to the entire world as El Chapo. El Chapo grew up dirt poor. No education, no connections, nothing. But what he had was a sharp mind, zero fear, and a work ethic that most people don't understand. He started small, running errands, moving packages, learning the routes. And he was fast. People inside the organization called him El Rapido, the fast one, because of how quickly he could move drugs across the border. Then in 1978, Pedro Aviles was killed in a shootout with police, and the whole operation started to shift. In the late 1970s, these Sinaloa families began moving cocaine for Colombian and Central American traffickers, shifting their base of operations to Guadalajara. That's where the real money started to flow. By the mid-1980s, these traffickers, now organized under what was called the Guadalajara Cartel, were making hundreds of millions of dollars. They had routes, they had soldiers, they had corrupt cops on payroll. But they also made a mistake that changed everything. In 1985, they assassinated Enrique Camarena, an undercover DEA agent. That one act brought the full weight of the United States government crashing down on them. The DEA went to war. The Mexican government, forced by American pressure, began cracking down hard. The Guadalajara cartel collapsed, and from its ruins, something new was born. When the Guadalajara cartel fell apart, the surviving leaders split into factions and went back to their home territories. El Chapo went back to Sinaloa. After the breakup, El Chapo established the Sinaloa Cartel alongside his business partner Ismael El Mayo Zambada. These two men were opposites in almost every way. El Chapo was loud, bold, almost reckless in his ambition. He wanted to be known. He wanted power, women, luxury. He built lavish houses, threw parties, moved through life like a man who thought he was untouchable. El Mayo was the complete opposite. Quiet, strategic, invisible. While El Chapo was making headlines, El Mayo was making money. He avoided cameras, rarely moved, ran operations on the mountains, and built relationships with officials so deep that most people didn't even know his name. Together, they made a perfect team. The Sinaloa Cartel operated differently from other criminal organizations. Instead of the strict top-down hierarchy, it functioned as a partnership between powerful trafficking families who cooperated, protected each other, and shared routes. This decentralized structure made it almost impossible to destroy. You could cut off one head, and the body would keep moving. Now, how did they actually move the drugs? El Chapo was a genius when it came to smuggling. Early on, he had cocaine in fire extinguishers, cans of chili peppers, and car rims, methods so creative that even drug-sniffing dogs couldn't detect them. But the real innovation? The thing that separated Sinaloa from every other cartel? The tunnels. El Chapo invested millions hiring engineers to dig deep tunnels under the U.S.-Mexico border. These weren't just holes in the ground. They had electricity, ventilation systems, and even rail tracks. Entire truckloads of drugs could be moved underground, invisible to Border Patrol, invisible to satellites, invisible to everyone. The Sinaloa Cartel has been credited with building nearly 100 tunnels along the U.S.-Mexico border. 100 tunnels under the most surveilled border in the world. By the late 1990s, the Sinaloa Cartel controlled a significant portion of the drug trade into the United States. They weren't just suppliers, they were the supplier. Cocaine from Colombia, heroin from their own mountains, marijuana by the ton, all of it flowing north. Breathed a sigh of relief. And then, Angel Chapo became the face of the cartel. The DA wanted him. The Mexican government wanted him. And, eventually, they got him the first time. El Chapo was first arrested in Guatemala in 1993, extradited to Mexico, and sentenced to 20 years for drug trafficking and murder. He didn't serve 20 years. In 2001, he escaped from Puente Grande prison with the help of guards who had been bribed, slipping out either in a laundry cart or in a disguise. Think about that. He bribed his way out of a maximum security federal prison and then disappeared into the mountains for over a decade. For 13 years, El Chapo ran the Sinaloa Cartel as a fugitive. The U.S. put a $5 million bounty on his head. Interpol had him on their list. And yet, he kept operating, building the empire, moving the product, living his life. He was finally caught again in February 2014 at a beach resort in Mazatlan. Mexican officials celebrated. The president went on TV. The DEA, July 11, 2015, El Chapo vanished again. He escaped through a mile-long tunnel that ran from the shower area of his cell, the only spot not covered by security cameras, to a small cinder-block house under construction near the prison. The tunnel was fully illuminated, had PVC piping for ventilation, and was equipped with motorcycle on rails, built over the course of at least a year. Almost certainly with help from people inside the prison itself. The operation cost an estimated $5 million. When he walked out of that tunnel, a team was waiting with food, vehicles, and a change of clothes. It was the most cinematic prison break in modern history, and it actually happened. He was eventually captured again in 2016 in Sinaloa, extradited to the United States the following year, and in 2019 convicted and sentenced to life plus 30 years in federal prison. This time, there will be no escape. When El Chapo went to prison, most people assumed the cartel would weaken. It didn't. El Chapo's sons, collectively known as Los Chapitos, took over their father's faction and modernized the cartel, making it more ruthless, more violent, and more deadly. The four sons, Ivan, Alfredo, Ovidio, and Joaquin, had grown up inside the cartel. They understood the business, but they saw the future differently than their father. El Chapo's era was cocaine, marijuana, heroin. Los Chapitos became the architects of the deadliest drug epidemic the United States has ever faced, illicit fentanyl. Fentanyl is synthetic. It doesn't need poppy fields or Colombian suppliers. You need precursor chemicals, most of which come from China, a lab, and people who know chemistry. The Chapitos built those labs in the mountains of Sinaloa. They pressed fentanyl into pills that looked exactly like prescription medications, and they pushed those pills into every corner of America. Fentanyl alone killed over 100,000 Americans in a single year. That's more than the entire Vietnam War. In 1 year. Meanwhile, El Mayo, still free, still operating, kept the older networks running. The Sinaloa Cartel under these two leadership tracks became simultaneously a legacy criminal empire and a cutting-edge narco-terrorism operation. And then the whole thing started to crack from the inside. Remember that plane landing in El Paso? Here's what actually happened. Joaquin Guzman Lopez, one of El Chapo's sons, secretly cut a deal with U.S. authorities. He lured El Mayo onto a private plane, and instead of flying south into Mexico as El Mayo expected, the plane flew north straight to El Paso, Texas, where both men were taken into custody. El Mayo, the man who had never been caught in 50 years of criminal life, was ambushed by his own partner's son. On August 25th, 2025, El Mayo pleaded guilty in federal court for his role as a principal leader of one of the most violent drug trafficking organizations in the world. His arrest triggered something no one fully predicted. Since September 2024, the Sinaloa Cartel has been engaged in a deadly internal war between two rival factions, the Chapitos and Mayo, El Mayo's loyalists. The turf war between these factions has resulted in the deaths of over 600 people in Sinaloa alone. Between July 2024 and March 2025, gang-on-gang violence and attacks on civilians nearly quadrupled compared to the prior 8 months. The cartel that once prided itself on stability, on El Mayo being the calm, rational mediator between factions, was now eating itself alive. As of 2026, the Sinaloa Cartel is not dead, not even close, but it is wounded, divided, and under more pressure than at any point in its history. On February 20th, 2025, the United States officially designated the Sinaloa Cartel as a foreign terrorist organization, putting it in the same legal category as ISIS and Al-Qaeda. Two of the Chapitos, Ovidio and Joaquin, are now in U.S. custody. Ivan and Alfredo remain fugitives inside Mexico. The fentanyl operation continues, run by whoever is left standing. The internal Sinaloa war has redrawn criminal maps across northwestern Mexico, with rival organizations moving into territories that were once firmly under cartel control. And regular people, farmers, miners, shop owners, are caught in the middle of a war they never asked to be part of. In January 2026, the Chapitos faction was linked to the kidnapping of 10 mine workers in rural Sinaloa. At least 5 of their bodies were later found in a mass grave. That's the reality on the ground. Not glamour, not narco-corridos. Just bodies in the dirt and communities living in terror. So what do we make of all this? The Sinaloa Cartel started as a group of poor farming families in the mountains of Mexico. It became, over the course of 4 decades, the most powerful criminal organization on the planet. It survived the death of its original leaders, 2 prison escapes, the arrest of El Chapo, the full force of the DA, the U.S. military, and the Mexican government. And now, for the first time, it is genuinely fracturing. But don't mistake fracture for death. History tells us these organizations adapt. They rebuild. The fentanyl market didn't disappear when El Mayo went to prison. The tunnels are still there. The routes are still there. The demand on the American side of the border is still very much there. The Sinaloa Cartel's future depends on which faction wins the current civil war, who survives the next year, and whether the United States can actually hold the men now in its custody. What's clear is this: the story isn't over. El Chapo is in a supermax prison with no windows and no sunlight, likely for the rest of his life. El Mayo is in federal custody, a 76-year-old man who outlasted everyone, until he didn't. And somewhere in the mountains of Sinaloa, the next chapter of the story is already being written. If you made it this far, you know more about the Sinaloa Cartel than 99% of people. Drop a comment. Do you think the cartel survived this internal war, or is this finally the beginning of the end? And subscribe, because we're just getting started.